to Beijing, and he told Deng, we're ready to start those negotiations. During the fall of 1978, the United States and China carried on these negotiations. And the American representative was Leonard Woodcock. He was famous in the United States as a union negotiator. Although he was a union leader, he worked very well with management. He was considered somebody who was an honest person, both to the labor and to management. And he also was a very good negotiator. So in negotiating the normalization with China, Woodcock led the American side. In the middle of that picture, there is Huang Hua, who's foreign minister, who played a key role on the Chinese side. The final negotiations were between Deng and Woodcock directly. Here they are toasting the completion of those talks in December 1978. At the time, because Hua Guofeng was still premier and chairman, America was cautious in how we would issue the invitation for a Chinese leader to come to the United States. Woodcock said to Deng, who was the negotiator of the Chinese side, we are prepared to welcome a Chinese leader to come to the United States. They didn't say which leader, whether it was Hua or Deng or who. And as soon as Woodcock completed that, Deng says, I'm ready to come, how about next month? So in January 1979, here he is with the interpreter, Chi Chao-ju, who was a student at Harvard from 1948 to 1950, went back to China, and then he played a very key role. It just happened, by the way, that his roommate at Harvard was an American who went to the State Department named Herb Levin. So when China sent the first airplane to the United States opening relations, Chi Chao-ju was the first off the Chinese airplane, and he was met by Herb Levin, and they had been roommates in Thayer Hall at Harvard University in the fall of 1948. Here is Carter and Deng at the White House, and here they are signing normalization. After Watergate, Nixon was not particularly welcome at the White House. And Deng said, you know, we Chinese, we have an expression. When you drink the water, you should remember who built the well. And at the American side, the person who built the well of resuming Chinese-American relations was Nixon. So he asked Carter, could you invite Nixon to the White House when I come to visit there? And Carter agreed graciously. And here we have Nixon, the first time he was allowed back in the White House after he left under disgrace, back talking with Carter and Deng Xiaoping. Here we are in Congress. After Deng visited the White House, he went over to meet congressional leaders. In the middle of the picture, see that little guy Deng. To his left is that interpreter Chi Chao-ju, and to his left, there's a white-haired old man sitting down, Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House. And Deng had a long talk with Tip O'Neill, lasted about an hour. They became great friends. And Tip O'Neill told him all the ways in which the Congress tried to fight the White House. And in the end, he said, you know, we fight, we have lots of trouble, but that's good for the national system because it ensures that no one side really dominate the other side. And then Deng said, wouldn't work in China. He wanted to have one party strongly in charge, no division of authority. Deng visited various parts of the United States. Here he is in Atlanta. Here he is in Texas at a rodeo, and a young cowgirl rides up and passes him a cowboy hat, and here he puts on the hat. This became the most famous picture from Deng's visit to the United States. It became kind of a symbol. And the American attitude was, maybe he is a communist, but he seems like a guy you could deal with. He looks like a human. And Orville Schell, who was a reporter there, who had a China background, said that when that picture played in China, it had even bigger impact. Because in China, they'd been giving all kinds of talks about how awful imperialism was. picture carried the meaning, don't pay attention to all that imperialist stuff. American life is fun, you can begin to enjoy it, there's a lot to study, and so this picture became a big symbol. In my view, it oversold the case, because a lot of Americans began to believe that China Deng was really a capitalist like we were, and that before long they would have democracy too. And I'm afraid sometimes our public is a little simple in reaction and get carried away in the newspapers that don't always help. And I think that's what happened. So there's improved relations, but I think it did not prepare Americans for the fact that this is still a tough country that's still determined to keep communism and a very strong leadership. Here they are in March when they opened in Beijing, opening of the American embassy in Beijing. Out of each other in '75, and so when they had problems later on after Deng came to power, Bush Sr. often went off to Beijing. Here he is in 1982, carrying on negotiations about arms sales to Taiwan. When Reagan came to office, he wanted to normalize relations with Taiwan. Deng was terribly upset. But a year or two later, Reagan realized the United States has to work with China, and began to back off from normalizing relations with Taiwan. So he went to Beijing, and as you can see at the bottom of the thing, Reagan's comment at the end was, "Huh, he doesn't seem like a communist." In 1982, Maggie Thatcher went to China to explain to Deng that, you know, the planned return of the new territories in '97 has really caused problems in Hong Kong because investors are worried what's going to happen a few years later. Because it was just a few years after the Cultural Revolution, a lot of people in Hong Kong thought China could not administer a modern, world-class city like Hong Kong, and they're really very worried. So Maggie Thatcher proposed that even if sovereignty returned in 1997, that the administration should still be run by the British. Deng did not like the idea. As you know, Maggie Thatcher is known as the Iron Lady, and within China, Deng was sometimes called the Steel Factory. After the Iron Lady left that meeting, she went out and tripped down on the steps. And the Hong Kong papers played the scene as the Iron Lady bows down to the Steel Factory. But despite that tension, the two sides then carried on negotiations for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, they reached an agreement whereby China would allow Hong Kong to keep its own way for 50 years, and the British would pass on sovereignty. So here they are at the end of that 2 years of discussions when they reached the joint declaration, happily shaking hands with each other. Deng believed that entry of an international organization was not only important for China taking part and learning things and being accepted, but the membership would also push reforms back home. There would be new requirements that China would have to meet, and that would help push political change that he didn't have to go out on the limb to push, but would be forced on him by the international organization. Here is meeting President of the World Bank, 1980, when China became a member. Here he is meeting the head of IMF. I think most of you are probably old enough to remember in the days before Wikipedia, we used to have things we called the encyclopedia. And here in 1978, Deng thought it would be a big help if the Encyclopedia Britannica could be translated into Chinese, be a quick way of passing on knowledge of the world into China. So here he is with Frank Gibney of the Encyclopedia Britannica making arrangements for that translation. Deng loved to meet business people. He liked to meet people who were in charge of things. I've gone through the 5 volumes of the Chronicles of Deng in Chinese, and I can't remember if he ever met a delegation headed by an economist, but he met a lot of delegations headed by political leaders and also by business people. Here he is with some other business people, Macau business leader Henry Flock, Here he is with the Hong Kong business leader, Li Ka-shing. Here he is learning about information technology from another overseas Chinese, An Wang, head of an early computer company. Here Bush is again, Bush Sr. again, meeting Deng. Now, Deng believed that Moscow had made a terrible mistake by having too many enemies, spending too much money on the military. And so he felt that China ought to form good relations with all major powers. So they formed good relations with the United States, good relations with Japan, as I've shown you. And by 1989, he felt that they could start to form better relations with the Soviet Union. To be sure, in 1979, he had invaded Vietnam when he was so worried about Vietnamese and Russian cooperation in encircling China. But in the early 80s, he said the three conditions can be met. If the Russians would pull back from the northern borders of China, if they would pull out of Afghanistan, and if they would get Vietnam to pull out of Cambodia, then he would welcome the Russian leaders to come to the United States, to Beijing, and develop more normal relations. So that's what they were doing. Deng was so pleased, he invited the press from the world. But as you know, what happened in the spring of 1989 is that the protests, which had been under control, began to blossom. And the foreign reporters who went to cover the Russian-Chinese rapprochement found out that the demonstrations were much more interesting, and they gave worldwide voice to the demonstrators, which was, of course, played back into China through the Voice of America. And the public was quite up in arms at that point because inflation had grown so rapidly at over 30%. Wages had not grown in the previous year. So the public was supporting the students, and the demonstrations were going very wild. On May 20th of 1989, Deng sent in some troops. The crowds were so big they didn't have enough police to control them, so they sent in troops. And they sent in unarmed troops to establish martial law. But they were surprisingly stopped by the demonstrators. There were just too many demonstrators. So at that point, Deng and other top leaders felt there was no other choice. They pulled their military back outside the outskirts. They brought in reinforcements, large numbers, and then they sent in the tanks on June 3rd, 1989. There's the famous picture of the young man trying to stop the flow of the tanks into the center of the city. And Deng gave the final approval for the order that they should do whatever necessary to resume order, and of course they did. And although they sent out radio announcements that people should stay off the streets, a lot of people did not stay off the streets, and so the crowd and the police fired on people who did not let them pass, and at least several hundred people were killed in the famous June 4th, 1989. After that time, the relations between China and the outside world were very tough. There were many sanctions imposed. And Bush Sr. wrote a very touching letter to Deng. In the letter he said, you and I were close friends, and it's because of that that I send you this letter. We are imposing sanctions on China. Our purpose is not to weaken China. It's because we believe so much that democracy and the rule of law are so important in things that we stand for. And so that's why we were imposing sanctions. But it's been so hard to develop relations. So many things go wrong. But I want to send a representative